This video is sponsored by Skillshare. Skillshare is a growing online learning community with a myriad of inspiring classes that allow you to discover, explore, and refine your ambitions and get lost in creativity. Whether those ambitions are music and music production, creative writing, or even YouTube-related interests like marketing and film, Skillshare has you covered. Learn from the experts and discover new things about whatever topic is relevant to you. One class I enjoyed was called The Ultimate Self-Care Playbook. Discover and nurture your centered self with Jonathan Van Ness. I find that I can very easily get wrapped up in all this YouTube internet nonsense, and I often forget to take time for myself. Jonathan's class is all about taking care of yourself both physically and mentally, and it taught me a lot about nurturing myself, taking the proper mindset into the day, and how to justify investing in myself. Skillshare is constantly offering more classes, and there are so many here that I want to mention, but I just don't have the time. These classes are curated for learning, and that means no ads, so you can stay focused and feel like your time is valued. Skillshare's classes are also split into short, bite-sized lessons, meaning they can slot into any timetable. Skillshare has been so generous as to offer the first 1,000 people that click the link in the description a 1-month subscription for free, so you can start discovering and exploring your creativity. Mirror's Edge is a series I don't hear many people talking about these days. I mean, sure, it certainly has its cult following, a cult of which I'm a part of, but when telling some friends that I was making videos on both the first Mirror's Edge and Mirror's Edge Catalyst, I was met with the response of, "What's that?" Now, I'm by no means trying to say that I'm uncovering a dusty classic or something, because in the grand scheme of things, this game is not very old. However, it's important to remember that EA's expectations for games were very skewed given that they publish a lot of the most popular sports games. They likely wanted Catalyst to be a major player in the next generation. Furthermore, Mirror's Edge Catalyst, the first entry in what I think is a planned reboot series, is just something fans don't really talk about as much, and I think it's for good reason. There are some decisions that people will either like or not like about this game, and I think the biggest factor in what they like is perspective. Now, I think perspective is something important to consider when trying to evaluate Mirror's Edge Catalyst. This is because I believe that someone's expectations for a game are directly tied to their perspective of the product going into it, and I want to clarify that expectations and perspective are not the same as being biased. I was biased towards this game from the get-go because I love games with solid movement systems, and further because I love the first Mirror's Edge. But my expectations for Mirror's Edge Catalyst were heavily influenced by the marketing, and I think that is why I was generally pleased with the experience. To elaborate further, I'll give my own recount of my expectations for the first game, which released when I was basically a baby. Well, 9 years old. But regardless, I didn't really know how to keep up with the latest releases, so I only really knew about games through face-to-face recommendations and advertisements on TV. For Mirror's Edge, though, my only knowledge of the game came from a little slip that was included in another game I had. And based on this photo, I was thinking it was a racing game, like with a car. And while the idea of Mirror's Edge being a racing game isn't very far off, my expectations were minimal and I was expecting anything. Catalyst, on the other hand, as far as I was concerned and as far as EA was stating, was not, and is still not, a sequel. It's a reboot. And that may sound strange, but I actually understand why it was rebooted after only one entry, even if I may or may not agree with it. Mirror's Edge, for all intents and purposes, was arcadey and even to an extent old school. It had 8 tight-knit levels that were somewhat linear, and it thrived on replayability. As the years had gone by, we saw a huge shift from games with many intricate and linear levels to games set in one level, or more accurately, an open world. It offered more freedom, and it was something few games were able to pull off properly at the time. For reference, Assassin's Creed 2 came out the same year as the first Mirror's Edge, and while I love Mirror's Edge, I can't deny that Assassin's Creed 2's world is huge for the time and detailed as all hell. So comparing that to Mirror's Edge, well, it's a competition I don't think Mirror's Edge will ever win. These open worlds continue to expand further and further, and to see Exhibit A, look no further than the same series. Assassin's Creed Valhalla has an entire country for you to explore. You can even see the next logical step in this freedom of choice mindset in the amount of games today that are shifting continually to incorporating more RPG mechanics. Again, as we look at Assassin's Creed, where after Syndicate in need of a reboot, Ubisoft had to take a look at what was going to rake in the most cash, and they had to look at where gaming as a whole was heading. The next 3 games they released had damage numbers, skill trees, different gear, dialogue choices, all in the name of player choice, and it has been criticized heavily for abandoning its roots. And while I believe that's true, ultimately the amount of money they are bringing in is all the positive reinforcement they need, and this is indicative of a larger shift with developers. I don't want this to seem like a tangent about open worlds and RPGs, so I'll hold my personal opinions about them, but the point is, video games were moving in a direction where if you wanted to be successful, you had to have an elevated level of freedom. I think this chase for the trends, however, actually hurt Mirror's Edge Catalyst in a lot of ways, as its year of release is worn on its sleeve throughout the entire game, as it seemed to embody all of the trends trends at the time. Skill trees, open world, swinging on ropes or grappling hooks, and the list goes on. This is why actually, to an extent, I agree with rebooting the series. If Mirror's Edge were to become a big name in gaming, it would need to be reworked from the ground up. Adding to the fact that the story in Mirror's Edge didn't leave a ton of room for a sequel, and considering the low amount of players that actually played said story, it would just make sense to rework things. So all this just to explain my expectations going into this game was that it was Mirror's Edge, but with a modernized twist. I was not expecting a sequel, but just Mirror's Edge in an open world. With those expectations, I enjoyed the game a lot. That was because the gameplay was tight as ever, the combat was reworked to be more enjoyable in my eyes, and the story was the same as the first game in that I completely forgot about it right after finishing it. The art style was largely the same, but the graphical fidelity is something that still holds up to this day, all these years later. Others, however, don't really share that sentiment, and I was shocked to find out that this game received so many mixed reviews. The reviews stated that Mirror's Edge lost what made it so good in the first place, and while some new additions were welcome and in some ways improved on the first game, the features that were missing were ultimately what overshadowed the good things. So I think I've made enough vague statements about the game and expectations that I had for it. So let's get to the nitty-gritty, starting with the presentation and open world. The world here in the art style is quite similar to the first game, as most areas see a bright color contrasting against the overabundance of white. However, the greater fidelity allows the lighting to play a much larger role in establishing a true dystopian future, or in Faith's case, utopian. There's always this constant overstimulation as billboards, cameras, and lights emit illumination that cascades your vision, and this is doubly so when running during the day, when the sun's intensity is reflected off the glossy white rooftops. Something I really appreciate about this game's art style was just how washed out it looks, while also being stimulating. I find this hard to properly articulate, so I'll just skip to the part where I show you an example of what I'm talking about. During one of the early moments in the game, a mall is subject to an explosion, and this explosion was strangely beautiful.
Big explosion over here!
In stark contrast to the characters' reactions and the screams and the ash and debris falling from the sky, this explosion was genuinely awe-inducing, and despite the explosion killing hundreds, seeing that kind of organic nature and color destroy the monolithic man-made structure was almost poetic. And I can't gush about it enough. Something I mentioned about the first game's appearance was that the city felt less like an actual city and more like an obstacle course, and I still believe this, but this really insightful comment helped me realize that it is exactly how Faith saw the city in that game. To her, it wasn't a residential and commercial utopia, but rather a playground, and the objects highlighted in red were where her gaze was fixed. In the case of the rest of the city, as mentioned, it lacks color, but also as mentioned, it completely reflects the tone of the game. You may notice that while running, as you generate more focus and momentum, Faith's vision becomes far more saturated and vibrant, and when slowing down, the colors become more washed out and stale. I have to assume that this is reflective of Faith's perception of the city, as it's clear that her passion lies within running, and the city just comes alive when she's able to traverse such a landscape that is seemingly built for her. In the case of Faith herself, you actually see her far more than you might think, as a myriad of surfaces have this reflective gloss to them, allowing you to see the model for Faith, which looks good and believable. Her outfit is largely the same and looks quite good, though I'd be lying if I didn't think her starting outfit was a bit better. I just think it reflects the rebellious tones of the game even more. However, I don't think Faith would be able to jump from skyscrapers very well in skinny jeans. Fortunately, all the other models look good, and while some angles are not the most flattering, I think it's at worst ugly, and at best it's just the game showing its age. The cutscenes don't always share this sentiment, as some of them are pre-rendered, and some are not. The pre-rendered ones, though, are as cinematic as they can be, and wildly beautiful too, and they certainly worked better than the strange corporate art style of the first game, even if that was the point. Here, the cutscenes are the only instance where our view is pulled away from Faith's eyes, and I didn't find it immersion breaking, and in fact found it easier to care for Faith and the issues around her, as we were able to see anguish on her face during stressful moments, and perhaps the way she expresses herself in some instances was a little dramatic. Another thing that is far better in this game compared to the others is that Mirror's Edge Catalyst has an FOV slider, and it is immaculate. To be fair, in some cases it makes Faith's arm look like slender pipe cleaners, but I think it's worth since having a wider field of view allows you to obviously see more, but also to feel a greater sense of speed, which is where the game is at its most fun. Zipping around in this city, mixing in different moves is all too much fun, and it allows the game to, much like Faith, come to life at top speed. The environments themselves, or more accurately the different districts, are okay, but they all kind of blend together, which is just a product of the art style, so I won't really hold it against the game. Fortunately, the game does mix in some interesting interiors, like the first major building you enter and the construction site that you take down, and a lot of missions see you breaking the law in one way or another by entering areas you aren't supposed to, stealing things you're not supposed to, and destroying buildings that you are not supposed to, and it all follows this juvenile, rebellious tone. This tone is present in the story too, as Faith is presumably young and acts quite young too. Regardless of the city's districts somewhat blending together, it can't be stated enough that the game is stunning in the aesthetic and graphics department. I think the biggest thing that separates this game from its older sibling is the lighting. I think the art style of this game, and especially the design of the environments, are not very different from its predecessor, but the lighting is what makes this game more visually appealing to me. It gives the game a more cinematic feel and allows it to, for myself at least, be more visually pleasing and not look as flat as the first game. Now, it's understandable that a game like Catalyst being on a new engine would look better, and a lot of people agree that Catalyst looks good, but the gameplay department is where things get a little more complicated. Despite taking a multiple month-long break from Mirror's Edge, I never had to relearn the controls, and more importantly, how to use them. I still knew how to efficiently wall run, wall eject, slide, and how to chain these moves together like clockwork, and it was like riding a bicycle. You never really forget how to do it. Something I didn't mention in my first video was how easy it is to chain jumps and slides together, and that running around always felt so natural, and I believe that this feeling is somehow stronger here. Every old ability here feels smoother, and in an open world context, it feels as though it gives you a greater sense of freedom. In the case of the new abilities, I think they integrated so well that I actually felt debilitated when playing the first game because I had become so accustomed to the new movements and changes that were made here. Before we get into such moves, we have to mention the progression here because it's just one of the many points of contention within the game. So as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, one thing that pretty much every game was incorporating at the time was skill trees or some kind of skill-based progression. I don't mind skill trees at all. I think when done right, they can make a particular playthrough unique to you, though I've never cared much for the games that have very minimal skill trees. What I mean is that in a game like Borderlands, there are a limited amount of skill points, meaning that most players like myself will pick a particular branch to spec into. If we continue using Borderlands as an example, I have two sirens, one that is a cataclysmic glass cannon that relies on their singularity to deal damage to and slag enemies and bosses for when I'm playing solo, but when in a foursome, I swap to my healing siren that allows me to help my team who does more damage. In a game like Spider-Man, eventually you will have every upgrade, and so getting upgrades are less about speccing a character to be unique to you, but rather just to make a particular part of the game easier. For example, combat traversal or gadgets. This makes progression generally linear, and it means that by the end of the game, everyone gets to the same spot, just in a slightly different way. The trap that this falls into is that balance can be tough. In Mirror's Edge Catalyst, you will likely be focusing on movement, since that is what basically the entire game is built around. However, the final encounter in the game will be a slog if you didn't invest a decent amount of points into the combat. If you did invest heavily into the combat, then this final fight is a breeze. I don't really like this because of the way these upgrades work. For example, the movement section gives you new abilities and efficiencies to your traversal, which is good, except when these abilities are required for a mission, but whatever, that's a different issue. The point here is, unlocking the double wall run or the quick turn is really useful and truly changes the way you move around, but a large majority of the combat upgrades are damage based, and there are a reasonably small amount of combat upgrades that actually change the way you fight enemies. In most cases, it is literally just allowing moves you were already performing to do more damage. Hell, an entire line is delegated to simply doing more damage to enemies, and if you decide to invest into the gear or the movement, which is marginally more fun from a gameplay perspective, then you turn the enemies into near damage sponges. So obviously I won't just criticize something without offering a potential solution. I think they should just have the enemy's health bars the same across the board. Not that the grunt should have the same health bar as a specialist, but that as the enemies become more complex, they get more health. And instead of making a manageable amount of health tied to your upgrades, just make them take the upgraded damage from the start. I think a similar remedy could work on Faith's health, which by the way also takes up an entire line on the skill tree. Just give Faith a new health bar and damage buff every time she receives an upgrade to her line launcher, or through any story event. For example, when she changes from her Shriek clothes to her runner clothes, give her an extra bar. The excuse you can give is that with Faith's reinforced gear, she can take more damage in combat, but you don't really even need an excuse. You just have to allow the player to feel the progression by unlocking new moves and new ways to use their abilities, something they will inevitably notice, instead of some upgrades that just let her take and deal more damage, which don't really change much. To clarify, I'm not saying that this game needs to have an aforementioned in-depth skill tree like those in Borderlands, but rather that it should have upgrades that actually change the way you play the game, not two entire lines tied to damage dealt and damage received. The same could go for her parkour abilities. For things like the skill roll, instead of having it locked behind an upgrade, have a story mission where Faith has to take a long fall that can only be sustained through a skill roll, and Noah can chime in over the radio and say, "Hey Faith, don't tell me you forgot how to do a skill roll, right?" And from that point on, the ability can be unlocked. Another issue that having damage being directly tied to upgrades is that when players do skip out on them and the enemies begin taking ages to defeat, you lose out on what the combat attempts to achieve. The new combat mechanics here encourage momentum, and you do more damage if you take down an enemy from the air or while running along a wall. But without the upgrades, these wall run takedowns will not do enough damage to these guys, so you'll have to turn around and head back for another hit, which kills both your momentum and the pace of a fight. I will get into the combat more soon, but let's focus on the aspect of gameplay that is also influenced by your momentum: the movement. The new abilities here, like the double wall run and the double scramble, are simple but effective. They allow you to move more freely around the city and the interiors, and these upgrades in my eyes, while not entirely innovative, are great to have. However, not all upgrades are like this, one of which is the aforementioned skill roll, or as you may know it, the safety roll. Now, an obvious issue when making a pseudo-sequel like Catalyst is, how can they properly give the player progression if in the first game they started with everything? The safety roll is featured in the first game, and you have it from the start, but here, it is something that needs to be unlocked. Sure, it can be unlocked very early in the game, like within the first hour, but that to me was entirely unnecessary. It works within the context of the game, sure, but some could feel handicapped as they are so accustomed to this ability, and on top of that, not having it makes the free running momentum severely lacking. When a movement system is based around momentum, an upgrade shouldn't prevent you from keeping that momentum. I believe it should just allow you to do more with that momentum. A similar upgrade is the slide roll, which allows you to roll when sliding, which acts as a way to continue and recoup the momentum that would typically be lost during a slide. I think the difference here is that the roll isn't a necessity, and for that reason, I don't mind it being an upgrade. The other upgrades that see an improved version of an ability are perfectly fine in my eyes, since they just make previous abilities easier or more efficient. For example, the upgrade that just makes you faster on pipes and whatnot is welcome because it makes climbing pipes and ladders less of a pace breaker. They are still a momentum killer, but there isn't much you can do about that. I think this upgrade, however, is more of a testament to the world design, as one of the borders between districts in the city is a literal fucking ladder that takes ages to climb without this upgrade. Another painfully slow obstacle to traverse in the first game was the vents, as Faith had to slowly crouch walk through them, but here, she flat out gets on her hands and knees and hauls ass through vents, which I think was a good decision. Vents, even in something like the Arkham games where on-foot movement is not a primary facet of gameplay, have had the vent crawling criticized as a pace breaker, so seeing a game that isn't afraid to rush you along these was pretty nice. Regardless of some upgrades being more effective than the others, movement as a whole, once you collect all these upgrades, is so good. For now, we can address the most significant change, which is the grappling hook. This is one of those trends that we mentioned earlier, as it seems some other games I was playing at the time also included a grappling hook. Now, I'm just one of those people that likes grappling hooks, and I think in a lot of games it can improve the movement, and here, I think it does to an extent. Using the grappling hook to swing from one building to another works in that it can act as a barrier between early and late game areas, but also because it can allow the level design and the city to not feel as densely packed. The movements are pretty linear though, and it is rare to see anyone actually missing a grappling hook because no matter what angle you hit the grappling point, you'll still swing in whatever direction the game pleases. There's also a story-related upgrade where you can pull yourself up, and that works fine. It isn't used too often, and I never found myself grappling somewhere and feeling as though I could have used my movement abilities to get there instead. I think the only issue I have with the grappling hook is the pull-down ability where Faith can pull down unstable scaffolding and walls with the use of the hook to open a new avenue. I think this is a bit of a pointless upgrade as it just halts your momentum and speed to just pull down a wall that could have just not been there in the first place. And I don't feel like I need to go into more depth than that, right? Game want fast, obstacle make you slow, ooga booga, we're done here. Something that I think makes the game's movement feel underwhelming for some is that there isn't much here that is explicitly new. Yes, double wall runs and scrambles give you a new sense of freedom for sure, but I don't think it changes the way you move that much. I think this game could have benefited from more new abilities. Its level design lends itself to freedom in your movement, but its moveset is constricted. Why not potentially add a Kong that can allow you to seamlessly flow over vaultable objects? Perhaps this ability would reward you with more momentum, but the timing could be strict. Within this hypothetical, you can have the decision to either slide under an object, which would be safer but slows you down, or take the riskier Kong attempts, which if done with proper timing could yield greater speed. I think an overhaul like this would have done the game some greater favors, and I feel like I haven't talked about the movement that much here, but that's just because I already talked about it and sucked off the movement in the first game in my video on the first game, and there isn't much here that's different. Fortunately, as mentioned, the combat saw a greater overhaul, and I'm a little torn on it. The combat here is far different from the first game, as you don't use any weapons aside from your body, and your greatest weapon here is actually your speed. There are now different subsets of enemies here, all increasing in difficulty and annoyance if I'm being honest. There are light and heavy attacks, though the light attacks are phased out quite early on, and even the heavy ones are too. The light attacks are delegated to the basic baton enemies, but these guys can also be taken out with some heavy attacks, which generally do more damage and are more efficient. Then there are the heavier enemies that function the same, except light attacks do not work on them. Then there are the ranged gunners, then another heavier enemy that shoots you with annoying accuracy. Then there are the sentinels, which are like mini bosses. If it seems like I skimmed over the enemy's moveset, it's because they don't make much of a difference. Most of the enemies, if taken on head on, can't be attacked with your fists, and using an exhausting amount of strafing and sidekicks are a toss-up because their counterattacks can shut down that option quite quickly. You can use a heavy attack to make an enemy near cartoonishly stumble into one another, or an obstacle, and this is useful, but I found the situations where I could make use of this sparse. You can also strafe around an enemy, and this is the only way to actually dodge attacks, though in reality you'll likely see yourself just spinning around and around and around these guys. Fortunately, as mentioned before, if you have more speed, you can do more damage by performing traversal attacks, meaning you could springboard from a box and then land on top of an enemy, or run up a wall, turn around, and kick whatever enemy is chasing you. This in concept is fun, but also as mentioned before, when the enemies take multiple hits to go down, you lose the sense of flow. I think rather than asking the player to play cat and mouse with these guys, we should just have a more in-depth combat system. Perhaps we could then use the traversal attacks to take down the weaker enemies and to do damage to the harder enemies at the beginning of a fight. I think when in an actual fight, we should have a type of counter system, and in order to integrate this seamlessly with the abilities already present, we can use the strafe ability as a way of countering. We can have enemies that attack with either their left or right hands, and our goal is to, with acceptable timing, strafe in the direction of the attack to block it. If an attack is blocked, an enemy will be open to a counter attack. Hard enemies could then incorporate combos, where they mix in left hooks, right hooks, uppercuts, and if all dodged correctly, will give Faith a proper chance to take them down. This could also solve another problem in the game, which is the difficulty. The game isn't very tough in the combat department, and the quote-unquote harder enemies are only harder because they take more time to defeat. The way you defeat them isn't very different. It just felt artificial. Like, the Sentinels are the toughest enemy in the game, but that's just because they do the most damage and take the most too. There isn't more complexity to taking these dudes out. Something else that lacks a bit of complexity is the runner's vision. The runner's vision has been criticized quite heavily in this game for holding your hand too much, and I don't have much to say on it because you can turn it off. I do think it can eliminate exploration, but the game always tells you the red line showing you where to go is almost always not the fastest way to get somewhere. I think it's actually helpful in the open world, as it can help you learn what paths go where. I found myself leaving it on for most of the time because it doesn't actually activate unless you have a waypoint in the open world, and you have to press a button to activate it too. There's also an option to use the same runner vision from the first game if you like the old school style. So overall, the combat here is in my eyes far better than the first game, but it's not like the bar was set that high. While the new system here has higher highs than the old system, I think it also has lower lows. The repetitive nature of it can be discouraging, and on top of that, the reward for traversal attacks is so much more efficient than anything else that it limits not necessarily what you can do, but what you want to. I think the movement is entirely where this game shines, and that's no surprise. The movement could have used some more mechanics and abilities, but at the end of the day, what we have is fun, and a ton of it. I think the gameplay as a whole instills this feeling of rebellion the same way something like the swinging in Spider-Man does. You have so much freedom, and throughout nearly the entire game, you're partaking in illegal activities and exploring areas that are off limits. Of course, the gameplay mechanics have never exactly been the main appeal of Mirror's Edge, and I think that title goes to the level design. I know that on the surface that sounds ridiculous, but what I mean is that the original Mirror's Edge had fun gameplay, but the replayability in the greatest times came from exploring the different levels and finding different ways to traverse them. That's not to say the gameplay there or here isn't good, because trust me, it is, but the level design and more importantly the open world design is where these two games see the largest differences. open world here is certainly open, and I only clarify that because I'm also going to say that it's one of the most linear open worlds I've goofed around in for a while. The best way to describe it is that it's less of an open world and more of a really big mishmash level where there's a bunch of linear paths that very loosely connect with one another. Sure, there are different districts, but the transitions between said districts are so linear and pace killing that it makes me feel like I'm just running the same paths over and over again. I think a reason for this is because I actually am. A lot of objectives in the main story and even the side quests see you running from one end of the city to the next, and that became a little tiring. I think that the side missions in this game allow you to really discover every nook and cranny in the city, and to discover new paths to take that are more efficient than the path initially shown to you, but this isn't always present in the story. As mentioned, the world is good to look at, so it's not like it's just boring on the eyes, but it's what you actually do in the world that kills it for me just a bit. There's so many instances of the same obstacles being used. You're often just vaulting over a generator or a pipe, and there's rarely any danger in these different obstacles. I think that if we're gonna get an open world, it should resemble an obstacle course more than a city, and it should be far more vertical than it already is. I think another thing that needs to be factored in with this is the danger. A major appeal of parkour in our real world is the danger aspect of it. I know that not everyone likes the danger, and of course nobody wants to get hurt, but what makes it fascinating, especially as a spectator, is that these people are doing insane stunts and jumps, and if one thing goes wrong, these people can suffer life-threatening injuries. Mirror's Edge Catalyst does a really good job of making you feel the panic and fear of falling off a high-rise. Faith starts hyperventilating, her vision becomes blurred, and it all cuts right before she hits the ground. Yet, at least within the open world, you won't even see this stuff unless you make a brutally incompetent jump. Why not add more jumps that are over wide gaps that lead to your death? Why not have buildings or even entire sections that are only traversable by a building's outskirts, where any misstep could lead to your death? The mechanics here are accurate and reliable enough for something like this to work so well. I also think that the different pathways here don't necessarily lend themselves to Mirror's Edge's biggest strength. Something great about the first game was replaying levels and finding the most efficient and stylish way of traversing the path in front of you, but here, in the open world, there isn't always a ton of room for that. This is because the world consists of a lot of straight lines. Sure, not every large distance between two buildings is going to be littered with enough air conditioning units and pipes to make it fun, but there are so many parts of this world that are just running in a straight line and vaulting over a few things. For example, take the transit hub, which, if going in one direction, sees you using the grappling hook a few times, and in another direction sees you jumping and sliding over a few pipes. In another direction, you have to climb a painfully long ladder. Not only does this take a while to climb, which is slightly remedied by the upgrade, but it also kills all of your momentum. Not all of them are like this, as mentioned, since other transitional areas see you incorporating the new wrist-mounted grapple gun to swing across gaps, and while it isn't anything new that'll blow you away, it will at least allow you to transition from one district to another while keeping your momentum, which is what I believe they should all do. Instead of a large ladder, they could have had a vertical corridor that sees you making quick wall ejects and scrambles to climb to the top. I understand that it's hard to keep momentum going when moving vertically, but this could at least keep it engaging for the player. I want to clarify that it's not like there aren't any alternative paths to take, because there certainly are, and there are hours of fun to be had just discovering different routes. For example, in the construction district, you can run around this massive hole and use the wall to cross the gap. Instead, though, I found I was able to use my grappling hook to swing to a container that was much higher, and I could use the walkway to cross the gap instead. There were certainly instances of this across the world, but I found myself wanting even more of it. I think the reason a lot of people didn't find these paths was because the game doesn't necessarily make it accessible for you. What I mean is that when trying to get from point A to B in the fastest way possible, I could find new routes that shave near minutes off my time, and that was insanely rewarding. But in the main story, which is likely what you'll do first, you aren't familiar enough with the world to know these different routes. I think the game should have further encouraged you to participate in the dashes, as they are perfect for learning the ins and outs of the city, making exploration more fun. I also found that the load times on console were long enough for me to not bother experimenting with different routes at all, as one fall meant I would be met with a loading screen for 20 to 30 seconds. On PC, I would sometimes just have the game load for minutes at a time, but I haven't read anything about this online, so this might be a problem exclusive to my computer or my hard drive. I can at least say that the checkpoints were really solid here. I know that it may seem like I don't like the open world, and of course I do. I just love goofing around in here, and I didn't want the things I pointed out to seem as though they ruined the open world. They just prevent it from reaching its full potential in my eyes. I also don't want that to take away from my general feelings of liking the open world a lot, and I feel like my 13-year-old self is slightly vindicated for having been right about Mirror's Edge working in an open world context. I think that the open world as a whole works perfectly fine if it was simply used for any other game where movement isn't the focus, but here it felt like it was, to an extent, missing what made the individual levels from the first game so good. And I think that's why players said that they felt this game lost what made the first so good. I think it's not that the mechanics were changed or that the new art direction was ugly, but rather that it didn't allow for the same replayability and freedom that the first game did. I think the world could have incorporated more interconnected paths and layers to achieve what fans wanted from it, it, and to make a world that you can explore endlessly, finding different ways to optimize your path. Fortunately, the individual levels in the game felt like you were right at home. Some missions here take place within the open world, but a majority of them actually take place within designated buildings like the aforementioned construction site. A lot of them see you destroying something or stealing something. One of the first saw you breaking into a corporate building after hours, and there were tons of different ways of traversing this. You could follow the usual path to the floor above by jumping from platform to platform, or you can grab onto the decorations that are on the side and climb it like a ladder. Sure, that option may not be as glamorous, but as mentioned before, completing things in an unconventional way is totally satisfying. I actually think most of the interior environments are fun to explore around in, and while the objectives were always get from point A to point B, I never felt that they needed to be anything else. The set pieces make getting around enjoyable too, such as when you have to use your grappling hook on a windmill and ride it up to a higher point on a tower. And this was so badass that the game decided to do it twice, and let me just say there's no complaints over here. The segment where you have to climb an elevator shaft while dodging debris was also a good time and a solid mix-up for the climbing. It's one thing for a movement system to give you this visceral, rebellious feeling, but the fact that the tasks you complete with such a moveset are all illegal makes the feeling of being a badass outlaw even greater. Adding to the fact that you are far faster than every enemy, and considering that Faith traverses a city in a way that makes me believe she could do it in her sleep, and it gives the world and gameplay as a whole this sense of insurrection that just fits the game so well. The interior environments leave a solid amount of room for exploration, and there are secret collectibles that reward you for heading off the beaten path. I don't expect, nor do I really want, anything else from the game because there isn't much you can do with a movement-based system other than giving you different places to move around in. I wouldn't have minded seeing more moving environments though, like the first game that had a train level. There is a train level here, but the game goes to a strange length to dance around it. When we first see Faith jumping onto a train, we see it in a cutscene and I was quite disappointed, but then I was given a train sequence quickly after, and this was actually quite funny. The train sequence is so short and consists of so few obstacles, and in fact the first obstacle requires lightning fast reflexes to the point where I don't have footage of me dodging it, and it almost felt like a rebellious statement, like the game was saying, fine, here's your stupid fucking train level, are you happy now? Never ask me for anything again. I don't know, it was just hilariously short that I couldn't really take it seriously. This is a theme that is seen across the game, an idea from the first game brought back and done in a way to give the player some deja vu. There's some familiar crane jumps, an overhauled shard, and a rework of Faith's hideout. This doesn't mean that there aren't some original fun jumps to make here, like the one at the end of the game where you leap from literally the tallest building in the game to a blimp and then slide off the blimp to a convenient pad below, but there's definitely some fan service. So of course, as mentioned, the objectives of the main quests are less important as a majority of the fun can and will be had in replaying these individual levels, but with an open world at its disposal, Mirror's Edge has some side activities and some of them are surprisingly good. A lot of them are simple A to B objectives present in the main story, but there were some that rewarded exploration and gave you some fun puzzles. The first is the grid leaks, which are pretty simple. You just collect them for the sake of it and for some experience, but it actually went pretty far in getting me to explore the world. Why was I inclined to actually collect these things even when they were off the path to my destination? Because they were shiny. I'm a caveman when I play games, and because I'm too stubborn to just grab something later, I spent a good amount of time thinking, I wonder how I can get up to that. This rings true for the billboards around the map too. I like these a lot because they slowed down the game. I know that something that slows down this game sounds bad, but a lot of the mental work in the game comes from getting to the spot in the most efficient way possible, but with some of these, my goal was entirely to get to the spot. I'd have to make use of proper timing and look at my objectives from different angles to see just how exactly I'm supposed to get up there. A more linear form of this is seen in the grid nodes, which are used to unlock fast travel points, though in a game like this, fast travel isn't used very much. These futuristic interiors offered a great environment for you to make use of the different wall runs and ejects, and what I loved about these interiors were that you could really get around somewhere however you wanted, and through my 2 playthroughs, I was able to complete all of them using different routes than I initially did. It encompassed some of my favorite parts of the series, where the challenge was less in getting somewhere fast, but rather in getting somewhere at all. I'd say they are my favorite open world activity, and are a solid twist on the Ubisoft towers that we've seen in a million other games. Transitioning again to the open world, we have the dashes. Now, I mentioned the open world did not leave a ton of room for traversing areas differently, and I think that's because you're often moving through one linear path to the next in the main story, and you don't have a good reason to practice the same route over and over again because, what, you're just gonna run across a block and then run back to do it again? Well, the dashes give you the perfect excuse to start at a point of the city, get to another point, and retry it as much as you like. I absolutely love this because I could follow the direct path that the game guides you on to get 1 star, maybe 2 if I really hustled, but the 3-star ranking is completely out of reach unless you start thinking outside the box, and you have to find new routes that can shave literal minutes off of your run. Now, to be fair, the real fun with these comes from learning the different exploits that can increase your speed to insane levels, but there are far better videos that explain those mechanics, so I'll leave that stuff to the pros. Regardless, these made the open world far more enjoyable enjoyable in my eyes. Now there's one thing here that I didn't have a ton of experience with until getting footage for this video, and that is the time trials, and my god do I feel like I missed out big time. I didn't bother making any because I figured, some of them already exist, and I barely played any because I figured they wouldn't be as good as the dashes that are already present. I'm telling you now, if you've played Catalyst, enjoyed it, but didn't dabble in these bad boys, go back in. Making a course is as simple as placing checkpoints wherever you want, and uploading courses is as simple as it gets. The ones others have made take you around different parts of the map and made me engage with certain areas I hadn't before. And I only needed 10 minutes or so of footage, but I became so distracted by trying to improve my time that I spent nearly an hour playing before realizing I had to get back to work. Because of how easy it is to make these races, there are always new ones popping up, and they completely remedy an issue I had with the game before, where I said that running through a portion of the city only to run back wasn't as fun. And with this, you can just make your own race and run it as many times as you like. I love this feature, and I wish it made its way into other movement games like Spider-Man Miles Morales and the Assassin's Creed series. God forbid they actually put a proper movement system in their games again. There is a series of side jobs around the map that are very similar to the dashes, and they see you delivering packages, and some have some twists on them, with one seeing you not being spotted and so on. I like these a fair bit, especially because they just sort of ask you to go from point A to point B with no guides, and they reward you for having a decent knowledge of the city. I think this doesn't always apply to the diversions though. The diversions see you running into different KSEC patrols and getting them to chase you while a different runner completes a mission in the chaos. I think the issue with these is that you quickly lose the KSEC pursuers and you just sort of run into a crowd of them and then turn right around to go to the next location, and they end up just acting as another race. I think they could have been more engaging if you had to stay within a particular area and essentially run circles around the KSEC patrols. For what they are now, they work fine, however the locations of these patrols can be a little unclear, and because the time limits were often strict, I found myself not knowing the route right away. That's fine, but because the route is not given to you right away, it leads to a lot of trial and error that makes optimizing a route a bit more tedious than it needed to be. The little brother of this mission is the towers, which see you pulling a component from it and then running from the KSEC reinforcements. I personally didn't care much for these missions because outrunning the KSEC patrols isn't very difficult, but I found that losing the helicopters and drones were a pain in the neck most of the time. This makes sense, of course, because the conglomerate has surveillance all over the entire city, but when this translates to gameplay, it meant that each of these missions saw me just gunning for the nearest safe house. There are also some collectible missions tied to a greater side mission called the Metagrid, and it sees you grabbing red grid nodes, and I like these a fair bit because it was all about creating a route to grab the grid nodes quickly, and they were never too challenging, but took some thought and a few attempts. They obviously fall into the same category of a lot of these missions where it's just do a thing but fast, but I like them regardless. So a lot of the side missions I've listed off are less actual side missions and more side activities, however, they are just small distractions when compared to the actual side missions, which I liked a lot. They allow the world to be fleshed out, much like the audio logs around the map, and while the stories within them never leave the realm of explaining character motivations and offering fun interactions, they were far more fun than I expected them to be. One sees you breaking into a woman's apartment, planting bugs with hopes of catching a married man cheating, and with the evidence, the wife will then be able to get a divorce. Another sees you entering a construction site and climbing to the top of a radio tower to plant a device that helps expand Black November's reach. While we do this, we learn more about what the rebellion is truly fighting for, and more importantly, why. There were a few others, but I ultimately can't talk about all of them. They all offer room for Faith's personality to shine through, and I actually find her far better here than in the main story as far as her attitude and writing goes. Overall though, these missions were a treat, and while they were just basic missions, they were just as interesting as the main missions in some cases, and I can't help but commend a game that can do that. So the last thing I want to mention about the gameplay is the final encounter. The final boss is probably the most disappointing part of this game. I actually don't even know if I want to call it a boss fight, but it's more of a final encounter. It's just two sentinels, and my god, they thematically speaking are so damn boring, and there's actually a scene where Faith in a cutscene has an actual duel with the antagonist's daughter, and it looks so badass, and it very well could have been achieved with the potential combat overhaul I proposed earlier. Your opponent can have intense combos that need to be countered to get a hit in, and thematically this would work so well in the narrative for reasons I will get into later. For now though, the two sentinels are a non-fight because you just run circles around these guys, vaulting over computers to kick them, and it didn't even leave me disappointed. I was just confused, like, that's it? That's how we're doing this? I mean, to be fair, it was more engaging than the last encounter from the first game, but I just feel like with an actual combat system here, my expectations were a bit higher. Outside of that, the combat set pieces were solid enough, though I didn't find the set pieces around these combat sections to be anything to write home about. I think that's actually a phrase that can be applied to most of the set pieces, as they all do their job and do it well. It may not have been the best I've ever seen, but I certainly never looked at any and thought to myself, well, that was boring. I mean, the final level sees you walking along a glass pathway that is breaking beneath you, and you have to outrun the platforms, and that was a memorable level as a whole for me. Unfortunately, another aspect of the game that was memorable was the story, but not for the best reasons. Oh, I legit forgot to add a title to this. Fuck it. I don't like the story very much. That's the title. The setting is the future, where a corporate conglomerate has control over the entire city, with the runners being a group of outlaws who deliver illegal goods across the rooftops. While the work they do is illegal, there's an unspoken mutual agreement where the runners don't mess with the conglomerate and its leader, Gabriel Kruger, and in return, the runners are not hunted down. The story begins with a flashback to Faith as a child. In this flashback, we see a man later revealed to be Gabriel Kruger, killing her parents and her sister Kat. We wake up from this now revealed nightmare and find that Faith is now, after 2 years, being released from prison. Before 5 minutes though, she's contacted by a fellow runner named Icarus, who seems to have a bit of a chip on his shoulder and allows Faith to stop seeing all the pop-up ads on her grid link, which is like a futuristic Google Glass. All the citizens are connected to the grid, which allows them to be tracked and controlled, though the runners refuse this. Upon getting back to the hideout and meeting with Noah, the pseudo-leader of the runners, it seems that Noah and Faith have had some history together, and they share a father-daughter kind of relationship. We're told that Faith has to repay her debts to Dogen, a crime organizer. Her way of repaying her debt is realized by grabbing a very valuable hard drive on a regular data run, but that draws the attention of Kruger. Despite Noah's anger and Faith meddling with Kruger, he sends her to an associate named Plastic, who has the skills to decrypt the drive and allow Faith to properly bargain with Dogen. Faith finds out that the drive contains a top secret plan for a project called Reflection. As Faith is meeting with Dogen and Icarus is out on a job, the hideout is under siege by Kruger's men looking for the drive, and they kill everyone there. Icarus and Faith, with nowhere to go, seek shelter in the underground hideout of Black November. Black November ends up capturing Isabel Kruger, and Faith and Plastic break into the Kruger servers to find out more information on her, finding out that she is in fact Faith's sister from the flashback, and that her parents were the creators of Reflection. After Faith stops a planned execution of Isabel, and in return, Isabel mentions that Noah is in fact alive and held in a place called Kingdom, we head there. And while in there, Faith rescues some scientists that were working on Reflection and reveals that Reflection is a nanite injection that allows Kruger and the conglomerate to control the user's thoughts and emotions. Faith finds Noah having Reflection experimented on him, and he unfortunately dies before Faith can save him. Meanwhile, Black November is transporting Isabel to a different part of Glass, but the convoy is ambushed and Icarus is injected with Reflection, meaning that we have to act fast. Plastic develops a virus that can destroy Reflection, but they need to broadcast it through the shard's antenna, and they gain access to that by breaking into Kruger's apartment and grabbing his ID. As Faith is planning her attack, there is an explosion at the shard, which makes her ascent more complicated, but when reaching the top, she is interrupted by both Kruger and Isabel. Faith uploads the virus and attempts to get through to Isabel, but is unsuccessful. Isabel and Gabriel attempt to leave by helicopter, but Gabriel is killed in the process. The game ends with Isabel and Faith parting ways, and Faith explains that in the end, not much really changed. Sure, she stopped Reflection, but the conglomerate still holds a tight grip, and the game ends with a hint at something more coming in an assumed sequel. Where do I start, man? Let's tackle this one at a time, starting with the length and the pacing, as that's where a majority of my issues lie, and it's where a lot of the issues could potentially be remedied. The story will only take you around 8 hours, and a lot of that time will of course be gameplay. All of the cutscenes together total anywhere from around 45 minutes to an hour, and not a lot can happen in that time. For example, Noah dies pretty early on, and we spend more time with him dead than alive, or at least presumably dead. We have barely any time to get acquainted with the character, and sure, we're shown that Noah and Faith are very close to one another, but we, as the player, don't feel that at all, because we barely know anything about either of them at this point aside from how close they are and that they both enjoy running, and are both to an extent rebellious. If we had been given more time to hang out with Noah, it could have made his death far more impactful, or at least the first one. His second death fell completely flat because he is assumed dead for so long and we couldn't get to know him when he was alive, so I just didn't care much when it was proposed that he might be alive. And when we do find him, he dies immediately, so it's like the game is just saying, oh no, he's dead, just kidding again, he's actually dead this time. If we had been given more time with Noah and more time to deal with his death, then I think it could have had a greater impact. I think a case where a character is fully realized despite the game's short length is Icarus. Icarus is immediately cocky, arrogant, and just overall a bit of a douche. But as the story progresses, we see him and Faith turn their reluctant partnership into a believable reliance on one another. When Faith helps Icarus escape his trap, they begin anew, but this time on the right foot. And when the ambush happens just minutes later, they're forced to rely on and get to know one another because they only have each other. And that's when they truly start becoming friends. I obviously wouldn't have minded seeing more of the two, but the point I'm trying to make is that given the pacing and the length of the story, this is the best that we get. I almost wonder if maybe it would have been better if Icarus was kidnapped later in the game and then dies. Perhaps then we could have Noah fill a similar role to Merc from the first game, instead of what we got this time around, which is Plastic. Plastic is a character you meet pretty early on, that from basically the first conversation will annoy the living fuck out of you. Her entire purpose is to serve is an expository character, and a guide not unlike Navi or Oracle. The issue is that she's constantly talking. Now, I brought up Navi and Oracle specifically because they both fall on different ends of the guide character scale. Navi does nothing but guide you, point you in the right direction, give hints, and so on. Navi doesn't have much of a character, and that's okay because that's not the point of her. Oracle, on the other hand, doesn't guide you much at all. Her purpose is not only to give expository information, but also give Batman an excuse to reflect on the events of the game without having him spend minutes in an internal monologue. She also doesn't have much of a character, but again, that's not the point. Where does Plastic fall here? On the ground. She missed the scale. She dumps exposition, but not in a way that prompts any sort of introspection. She also doesn't really give us any hints, and we know barely anything about her other than she takes statements far too literally.
Well, she might also have to hack a grid node for me. Might or will? That's not a binary question.
And that she is basically a genius when it comes to technology. It would be one thing if she didn't fill the role that she was designed for, but what makes it worse is that what she does say, and she says a lot, this lady never puts a sock in it, is always some cliche dialogue where she just ends up being yet another super smart but nerdy socially awkward stereotype. We have already seen this character in so many other games. Kenzie from Saints Row, Lester from GTA 5, but the difference is that those characters actually have characters to them. I get it. Plastic surrounds herself with machinery and logical thinking robots, so she likely hasn't brushed up on her social skills in a while, but I don't think this is a proper excuse to make her a flat-out robot.
Kuma is cute though. We like Kuma.
It's not that Plastic has a poor personality or that her character is lame, it's that she barely has one at all, and that she is more prevalent in the story than one of the most interesting characters, Dogen. Dogen is a character that is used sparsely, and I find myself feeling really confused on if he is actually a good character, or if he is the only half-decent character, and because we see him so little, he is just a knockout relative to everyone else in the game. Dogen is cold, caring, and that's about it from him. We don't see too much about him and his relationship with Faith, and it's only really explained in the tie-in comic to this game, Mirror's Edge Exordium. A ton of information regarding this game's story is left in this comic. That costs money, by the way, and information like what Faith did to land herself in jail at the beginning of the game is relatively important and shouldn't have been left to a different product. I think what confuses me and frustrates me the most about the entire story in Mirror's Edge Catalyst is that so much of it is contextualized in the comic. Near the end of the game, Dogen and Faith get into a scuffle of sorts, and they look at a painting on the wall which to the player has no significance since it was barely mentioned in a flashback. But to those who read the comic, they know that it was a drawing that belonged to Faith's mother, and Faith already went to extreme lengths to get it from Dogen, even going as far as almost killing someone. All of this context surrounding a painting that belonged to the person she had been trying to avenge for the entire game. Another thing to note is that the comic isn't marketed at all. I didn't even know it existed until doing research for this video. The comic itself is actually really good too. It's on the short side, but the story it tells is concise and presents a better look at Faith as a character, and her relationship with Noah, Dogen, and Celeste is actually present throughout a majority of the comic's latter half. It sees Faith doing some jobs for a different group of runners and eventually meeting Dogen, much to Noah's dismay. Faith then sees her mother's drawing, and in order to get it, she is tasked with stealing a particular type of medication, though we find out that someone has already swiped it. After meeting Celeste and her hideout in Black November, she sees that Celeste's sister is dying from a particular type of skin cancer, which can be cured by the very medication Faith was supposed to steal. Faith has to decide if she wants her mother's drawing, which is all that's left of her, or if she wants to save Celeste's sister. Save a life or hold on to one that has long passed. Faith eventually steals the medication, but then turns around at the last minute, returns it to Celeste, and is captured by Kasek, which then leads into the events of the main game. This story in the comic is far more interesting than the one we got, and the dialogue is far better too, and it just leaves me so disappointed that this was all but present in the main game. I mean, don't get me wrong, there's still this overarching theme of Faith basically mocking the rest of the city for working a cringe 9 to 5, but it's far more grounded. I would argue that this comic line is integral to your enjoyment of the game's story. I was torn here because with this comic, this is the complete story of Mirror's Edge Catalyst, and while with the comic included, the story is a bit better, I was just left even more so feeling like this should have been part of the game. It doesn't relieve all the issues with the main story, but it does fill a lot of contextual holes and satisfies my craving for a more well-rounded story. Unfortunately, even with the two products in tandem, the comic and the game feels entirely disconnected from each other, even if you can move past the fact that they are presented in entirely different art forms. I'm not saying you can't do tie-in comics. In fact, they can be really good. The comics set in between Infamous 1 and Infamous 2 work great because they give you more from the story of the first game, but if you don't read the comics, which a lot of people, including myself, didn't until recently, you you don't miss out on a thing. The game fills in all necessary gaps, and any further obscure context and stories are left to the comics, which still give them value without making them a necessary part of the product. The comic did more to show me what the game could have been than anything else. Even disregarding the comic completely, there's still tons of this game that left me desiring more. Look at Isabelle, for example. She is the antithesis of Faith, and is fought in a cutscene that I already mentioned should have been an actual combat encounter. Faith is all about free thinking, rebellion, rejection, and freedom. Isabelle stands for order, rules, rigidity, and control. Look at their character models, for God's sakes. Faith's hair just flows and lands wherever the hell it wants, whereas Isabelle's is always tied back. Faith's outfit is sportswear that's loose with a ton of pockets, and her arms are near totally exposed, allowing her to feel the wind as it crashes against her skin, and the colors are a combination of black, white, and red. Isabelle, on the other hand, is cloaked in white. There's no room for anything outside of the utopian vision and the status quo, a vision that is reflected in the city, which has blinding white plastered all over it. Her clothing is tight, sophisticated, and restrictive. There's no way that this wasn't intentional. Because of how often they meet in the game, Isabelle could have been a far better antagonist than Gabriel. Gabriel, while responsible for the death of Faith's parents, is barely present in the game, and it makes him an intangible villain. But Isabelle is present far more. If she was the main villain, it could recontextualize the entire plot, but it's not. Instead, she's just a pawn, and it serves as a catalyst for most of my disappointment. All of these relationships Faith has are littered with untapped potential, and unfortunately it doesn't get better when looking at Faith herself. Faith throughout the game shows little character and was actually a little repulsive at points, such as when feeling close to failure. She just collapses and pouts, throwing a borderline tantrum, and don't get me wrong, I'm not saying characters can't be vulnerable. In fact, most of my favorite parts of my favorite characters are their vulnerabilities and insecurities, because that can make them more grounded, but Faith's reaction here is so juvenile that I found myself going, oh, come on now, don't do that. I think Faith overall is fine, but I feel like her story could have been expanded even more if she had been given an opportunity to talk about how she feels about everything. I would have enjoyed Faith if she had been given more introspective moments about the future. This is something I wanted in the first game as well, but I think a solid discussion to have in a game with heavy rebellious themes is, how long can Faith do this? What if she can't run? What if she just gets too old? And what if she's caught? These questions could be answered through a personal arc. What if the game decided to take the concept of the first game and that Faith was injured and hasn't been able to run for a while, but this time when returning, she becomes scared, like she's never been before? What if now she can't make the leaps off cranes like she used to, and in her personal struggle, has to ask herself if this is what she really wants? To rebel and live life on the edge, and to question if it's worth it. Maybe through the story, Faith realizes that it's a risk that she does want to take, because dying would be far better than living a life without the freedom to do what you want. Of course, take that idea with a grain of salt, so I don't want this to seem like me criticizing Faith's character for not doing this, but rather just giving an example of what I think would work well. All this, and I haven't even talked about the ending. It's revealed that reflection is actually a cure for Isabelle's chronic lung condition. This twist comes pretty much out of nowhere unless you collected a couple audio logs, which it seems many didn't. And it adds this strange thickness to the plot where I think you're supposed to question if reflection is worth it to save those with illnesses, but it's never really expanded upon at all. Then Gabriel just tries to leave, in which a fight between Kat and Faith ensues, and Kat actually wins to an extent, but helps Faith right before leaving, which is also not expanded upon. So now she doesn't hate Faith? I'm not so sure. But then, and this is the weirdest part, she jumps into the helicopter that Gabriel was on and is now the only one there, so it's assumed that Gabriel died. I'm not sure if Isabelle was the reason for that or not, so while this final encounter feels very slapdash and uncoordinated, the ending monologue somehow gets worse for me. Faith talks about all that's happened and then proceeds to say, nothing's changed. She basically says, yeah, nothing's different. I mean, we stopped reflection, but the conglomerate is still strong. So fuck it, right? Deal with it in a sequel. Why not explain what's going on with Kat? Has she gotten in contact with Faith? Maybe she's planning on taking the conglomerate in a different direction. How is her illness? But there's none of that. I feel like this is a realistic ending for sure. I can appreciate a story that doesn't give the hero a happy ending, but I just felt that this ending was one of the most unsatisfying in a while. I think the world building here was actually pretty solid too. This oppressive conglomerate that forces every working citizen to follow strict orders contrasted with those who live completely off the grid. It contextualizes the 9-to-5 workers as robots, and while a concept like that is by no means the most original, it is an interesting concept that is worth exploring. The way that Faith and Isabelle are largely the same as children but turned out to be so different due to their different upbringings is also worth exploring, but instead they just focus on the revenge plot, which is contextualized in the comic and only barely contextualized in the audio logs. I also want to quickly talk about those audio logs because I think some relatively important information is delegated to it, such as Noah's connection to Faith, and I think telling a story through audio logs and item descriptions in a similar way that the Soul series has done it is incredibly lame. Personally, I don't want to collect random pebbles and weapons just to piece together the main objective of a game. game, but I understand and can appreciate that people enjoy that. And that's not me hating on the stories of these games, because Bloodborne has some of my favorite lore ever, but I've just never been a fan of the way these stories are delivered. In Mirror's Edge though, there are a few moments where they dance around important information. For example, Noah literally dances around what Faith did to land herself in jail, and it's all to promote the comic, which by the way, isn't promoted at all outside of a loading screen message.
She looks like a sweet kid.
She was. She is. We parted on not so pleasant terms.
What happened?
I don't want to talk about it. Maybe it's not for you to understand, but just to accept.
Why? If any of us here had done what she did, you'd have us thrown out on our butts.
I did throw her out. And I was wrong.
I know. Because she's Faith, right?
I think that the audio logs for Faith's parents should have been easier to find, considering they contextualize a lot of the plot, but it still doesn't matter that much because even with all the context, my issues still apply. You know, I don't want to sit here and make it seem like I want this game to have some profound social commentary and present a story with many layers of complexity. Sure, that would be nice, but I think there's still inherent value in a simple story that, while not being the best constructed, can be enjoyed if you just turn your brain off. I think the reason that the plot falls apart here is that in order to make a decent amount of sense of what's going on, you have to actually pay attention, and that leads to frustration. So your only options are to have barely any idea what's going on or to just feel disappointed. I hate talking so negatively about a story because I don't want it to seem like I'm getting on a high horse, but I can't help myself from feeling disappointed here. I can at least say that Faith's design was much better than that of the first game, but I can't really back that up with anything. I think if I had the final say, the comic should have been the main story here. It was far more interesting even if it didn't lend itself as well to the over-the-top set pieces. The story as a whole was easily the worst part of the game, and I wouldn't blame anyone for wanting to just skip the cutscenes. It seemed like there was so much room for the game to say so much, but it just ended up saying so little. I think Mirror's Edge Catalyst, through the lens of what was popular at the time, was in my eyes successful. It had an open world that, despite its flaws, I revisited on multiple occasions. It had skill trees that more or less offered a sense of progression, and a new coat of paint that still looks good today. I think the biggest issue here is that we have a game that set a very specific precedent, and yet the second game came around and changed things that didn't need to be changed purely for the sake of appealing to the widest possible audience. When you make changes to a product specifically to please the mass audience, it shows insecurity in the product that you have. Sure, it could have worked out if it was done right, but it seemed like everything here was done halfway. The upgrades are there purely to give the player a sense of false progression. An entire line of the combat section is just damage boosts. As I mentioned, the progression could have been achieved within the story and the skill tree could have just been left out. The characters here all feel half-baked, and that's because they actually are, with so many of them being split between this game and the companion comic that I just feel waters down the impact and the value of both the products. The level design was really good for the most part, but as mentioned, levels like the train one make me feel like some of the set pieces were done simply for the sake of pleasing fans. I know it sounds like I may not like this game that much, because I took a look at a lot of the negatives, and that is truthful, because I wanted to clearly delve into why it received the lukewarm reviews it got and why it wasn't as successful as it could have been. Something that can't be dismissed, however, is how, as a standalone product, this game is so good. Yes, there were plenty that could have been done better, but damn it if the things that were good, like the movement, the aesthetic, and the feel of the game, weren't borderline perfected. The movement here is so tight and enjoyable that I could run around any environment for hours just mixing my abilities together, let alone a beautiful open world that, while again had flaws, still cemented itself as a game that I won't forget simply for how unique it is, and for how addicting its gameplay is for me. I feel like there are a lot of cases where I have to put my biases aside in these reviews, and while critically this game has flaws, from a personal enjoyment standpoint, I fucking love this game. And when it comes to movement-based games where I can just chill out, listen to some tunes, and rip around a futuristic utopian playground, there is no game that gives me the same tornado of adrenaline, speed, and tranquility that Mirror's Edge Catalyst does. The game is a big world of rules, and the game gives you all the tools to break those rules, and the only thing you really want to do is to keep running, because it fills you with this feeling of freedom where nothing can stop you, and you traverse this city like clockwork, flawlessly taking down those who get in your way, and that is the art of rebellion. Hello, thank you very much for finishing this video. I appreciate it a lot. I worked hard on this one, and if you have any feedback, I would love to hear it in the comments. I haven't been reading comments as much. Like, I still read them all, but I've only been checking up on them like once every couple of days, just because, I don't know, comments kind of make me sad most of the time. I don't like reading them. But some of you guys do put like a lot of really helpful, constructive criticism in there, and I do appreciate that. 100%. I want to give a quick shout out to our gold tier patrons: Bossian, Christopher Moreno, Mark Short, Pyrite, Rory Powers, I can't say the rest of that, Sub2, Nams Compendium, Thomas Jones, and William Urodovic. Thank you so much, guys, for your support. And the silver tier patrons: Chiefy, Gonzo Gonzalez, and Jacob Douglas. Thank you so much. And the bronze tier patrons: Ben Conway, Denzel Ritesh, Nathan Figs, and Theodore Molligren. Thank you so much. I've said it 4 fucking times now. I'm sorry. I'm gonna shut up. Let's talk about the YouTube members. I want to say thank you to our gold tier YouTube member, That One Cat You Know, and our bronze tier YouTube member, GN Online Gaming. Your support is always appreciated, and if you want to support the channel and see these videos up to 3 days early, you can consider becoming a patron or a YouTube member by clicking either of the links in the description. Whew. You can also follow my Twitter if you like. I'm just like, I got nothing to say on this outro. I apologize. I think my next video is going to be ranking the Arkham games. And after that, I honestly don't know. I'm kind of in a spot where it's like, I got no fucking clue what I'm going to do. So yeah, I apologize that this video took kind of a while to come out because I was just really tired and I needed a break. And when I say like, oh, I'm taking a break just because I'm tired, like I feel like people get worried because they're like, oh, I don't want this YouTuber that I watch to like get burnt out or anything. And so it's not that. It's not that I was burnt out. It was just that it was like, yeah, I don't know. You just need a break every now and then. Yeah. So I just took like almost an entire week to just like do some shit that I had on the back burner, hang out with some buddies and whatnot, and just chill. So it was really nice. I'm glad to be back into the swing of things. With that, I think that's all I got to say. So yeah, thank you so much for watching. Share this video if you liked it. Take care of yourselves. Stay safe and stay healthy. I love you guys. Take care.